My name is Brandy Morin, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Guernica magazine. And I'm so pleased to welcome you here today on behalf of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. We're hosting this event co-convened with Unfpa as the first in a series marking 30 years of the Global 16 Days campaign to end gender-based violence. CWGL is the founding organizer and global coordinator of the campaign, and Unfpa is a wonderful and appreciated partner. We have a lot of people to hear from today and no time to engage in the kind of dialogue we would all love to, but I'm really looking forward to the comments that our panelists have prepared for us. A couple of housekeeping notes at the top. Our speakers will have the ability to mute and unmute themselves when they're speaking. And I'll try to warn you when you're coming close to the end of your time with one of those hand raises in the video. And I will, I hope gracefully, but unceremoniously interrupt you with my own voice on the off chance that you've got a different box set up than I do and can't see me there. Our event, of course, is being recorded. It's also being live streamed via the CWGL Facebook page. So you can join us there if you have a Zoom connection challenge. Our chat box is closed because thankfully we're just too popular. And we're using a couple of hashtags if you want to engage in dialogue that way. So you can use hashtag 30 years of activism or hashtag UNGA76, UNGA 76, as this is a side event of the UN General Assembly. So with that, I'm so happy to be here with you today. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists, and I would like to pass the floor to Professor Husseina Alidou, who is the faculty director at CWGL. Thank you.
You need to unmute yourself, sorry.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, sir. Good morning from Rutgers University in New Jersey. Thank you, Gina, for your kind introduction. I would like to begin by acknowledging the wonderful foresight of Unfpa, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Agency, in signing in 2019 a partnership with the Center for Women's Global Leadership, a feminist human rights organization affiliated with the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University, with the common mission to work towards eliminating all forms of gender-based violence and promoting gender equality and promoting women's human rights. This is a celebratory event to mark 30 years of activism and the first in a series of events which will continue through March 2022. The Global 16 Days campaign was initiated 30 years ago by the Center for Women's Global Leadership with the aim of galvanizing women and allies worldwide to raise awareness about violence against women and demand that government do their part to eradicate it. Since then, more than 6,000 organizations and other entities, including governments, UN and UN agencies, have used this campaign in over 180 countries to break the silence about many different forms of gender-based violence and demand public actions. This is a special year, which is why we are doing things differently for this special event, and a extended celebration will give us the opportunity to engage with many who have contributed in the global success and impact of the 16 Days campaign and its continued relevance, especially given the surge in the context of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. I wish us all a peaceful and engaging dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alidou. It's my pleasure now to pass the floor to Her Excellency, the First Lady of North Macedonia, Elizabeta Georgievska.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to sincerely thank Unfpa and the Center for Women's Global Leadership for the extended invitation to be a part of this commemorative event of the global 16 days campaign to end gender-based violence. It is of immense significance that we are discussing the issue of gender-based violence during this 76th General Assembly of the UN, which is a demonstration of commitment by UN agencies and their civil society partners. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that women not only can't have it all, but they have it worse. Women have been carrying the burden of the pandemic. They have usually been the family member that worked while taking care of household work and are the primary caretaker for the elderly, the vulnerable, and the children in the families. While we were running campaigns to stay safe and at home, the pandemic has shown that home was not the safe place for many women. Staying home increased the number of gender-based violence and domestic violence, where usually the victims are women. Gender-based violence should not be seen as a private matter. It is a human rights issue. North Macedonia is no exception from the global trends when it comes to gender-based violence and femicide. Most cases in femicide happen in a place which should be the safe haven for women, the home. Most of the perpetrators are the victim's current or past partner. Cases where domestic violence or gender-based violence is not reported or institutions do not support adequately could end as a femicide. Femicide is the most extreme form of gender-based violence and happen everywhere, no matter the location, ethnicity, social status, age. In the past 3 decades, North Macedonia had made significant progress in fighting gender-based violence. We have ratified the Istanbul Convention and have taken the obligation to align the national legislation with the Istanbul Convention, and the work is in progress. Authorities have highly prioritized the adoption of the new law on prevention and protection of gender-based violence and domestic violence. It laid down provisions that allow specific protection for all women victims of different forms of violence through establishing specialized help and support services aimed at advancing the system for victim support. Unfpa in North Macedonia, in partnership with the British Embassy, is working on operationalization of the law. North Macedonia made a huge step forward in the promotion of human rights, especially sexual and reproductive rights, child marriage, and other harmful practices. The intensive efforts invested by the UN agencies, national institutions, and civil society brought benefits. The cooperation between UNFPA in North Macedonia and Office of the President is long-standing and strategic. During COVID-19 pandemic, we jointly conducted targeted interventions on gender-based violence by raising awareness for women to report violence. We have had significant increase in public awareness about gender-based violence. The public now is more alert. There is more pressure by the civil society and media scrutinizing the institutions to act. We should continue to invest efforts in keeping the public aware and institutions accountable to work to end impunity. We should support the work of media so that they could provide a full picture when it comes to cases of gender-based violence. We must invest in resilient societies where women will have better access to the labor market. Economic independence enables women to be confident, to leave unsafe homes and seek justice. We should work with young people and schools to help them learn about gender equality and respect of their own and others' human rights. We should strive to have strong and independent institutions that work well together so that support to victims of gender-based violence is provided in a multi-sectorial manner and fight against impunity is achieved. And last but not least, we need empathetic society. Each and every one of us has a duty not to turn a blind eye whenever we witness violence. We must show empathy to the victims and help them reintegrate in the society. It is our duty. We owe it to each victim to lift them up and help with rehabilitation and starting over. If we continue with the partnership of international and national institutions, civil society, activists and media, we can do more and move from awareness to accountability. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Global 16 Days Initiative campaign, coordinated by the Center for Women's Global Leadership, for 30 years of successful activism to end gender-based violence. The campaign, which has been used globally by activists, including in my own country, Republic of North Macedonia, to draw attention to pervasive gender-based violence and to demand accountability, as well as legal and policy reform, has been a force for good in the world. It has inspired many other campaigns, many other initiatives, which are all needed to realize the vision of the world without violence. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Your Excellency. We really appreciate those remarks and your time with us today. And now we will hear from Charlotte Bunch, who is the founding director of CWGL and a distinguished professor at Rutgers University. And it was Charlotte who was one of the initiators of the Global 16 Days campaign. So it's really a privilege to have you with us today. Thank you so much. I suppose the place to really begin our conversation and to have you lead us is to think back on the journey of the campaign over the last 30 years. How would you summarize that journey? And how do you think the campaign is still relevant today, 3 decades later?
Thank you very much. And thank you in particular to you and the FPA for co-sponsoring this event. I want to take you back 30 years to a conference room in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where Rutgers University sits, and the first Women's Global Leadership Institute, sponsored by CWGL, where 25 women from 23 countries all over the world were gathered for 2 weeks to think about how do we get the world to see violence against women as a human rights issue. This was a time when the women's movement had been making violence more visible over the last 2 decades before that, and yet the human rights community and the UN did not recognize it as a human rights issue, called it a crime and an unfortunate thing, but did not see it as part of the human rights agenda. So in preparation for the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, women were gathered trying to think, how do we get this on the agenda of the United Nations, and in particular on the agenda at Vienna? And somebody said, well, why don't we create an international campaign and have local action coordinated globally around the theme of violence against women as human rights? And somewhere along that, generative discussion of 25 activists, we realized that International Human Rights Day, December 10th, was 16 days after November 25th, which had been recognized first regionally by Latin American feminists as International Day Against Violence Against Women, to commemorate the murder of the Mirabel sisters by the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic, a link again between domestic violence and the violence of war and conflict and dictatorship. And so we said, well, that's 16 days. So people often ask me, why 16 days? Well, that was how many days it was between November 25th, which we were trying to elevate as an International Day Against Violence, which I'm happy to say by the end of the 90s, the UN General Assembly also declared as International Day Against Violence Against Women. So it is now on our calendars throughout the world. And December 10th, Human Rights Day, when we all recognize the importance of human rights around the world. It happened to include two other important dates for us: World AIDS Day, December 1, and the growing link that was being made between violence against women and HIV/AIDS, and December 6th, the anniversary of the terrible Montreal massacre, where women engineer students were murdered simply because they had taken the place that a man thought should be his in the university. So our first theme was really quite simple. It was violence against women violates human rights. It was a challenge to get people to think about human rights from the perspective of women's lives. What were the fundamental ways in which the human dignity of women was violated? And over again, in relation to multiple issues, we saw how violence against women was at the core of maintaining the domination of women and denial of women's dignity when they stepped out of line in any way. So we began to work to change that paradigm, and the 16 days was a major campaign that would help people to see how violence against women was not simply a personal problem, but was a manifestation of a structural violence that had a purpose to reinforce male control or patriarchy in its many different forms. It began primarily with those 25 women who took it back to their own local localities and regions. I remember best Ever Joyce Wynn from Women in Law and Development Africa, went back to Africa and organized a region-wide campaign, one of the most vibrant that started. And of course, the women from Latin America who had started November 25th picked up linking this to International Human Rights Day. And it started in the 90s, really quite spontaneously globally, but at a local level. And through the 90s, and particularly the world conferences in Vienna, Cairo, and Beijing, the concept of women's rights or human rights took hold, and we began to think about how that affected women. In Cairo, around reproductive rights and women's health, in Beijing as a framework for the whole agenda. And by the end of the 90s, we felt the campaign was integrated, taken up by many UN agencies and governments. We had seen the creation of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the Declaration on Elimination of Violence. There was a sense that this had gone beyond our dreams of what could happen. And over those years, the campaign was taken up locally, often with themes that weren't even the same as the international, because our broad theme was, this is a global campaign, it's a global phenomena, but it must be seen and acted upon locally. And I think that's been the key to the campaign. The local manifestations of the global problem define how women bring this onto the world agenda. Unfortunately, my time is running out, but I see also, I just want to say that it's all too relevant still today. We have seen an amazing advance in awareness and attention and even changes in laws, but we don't have any discernible decrease in the incidence of gender-based violence overall in the world. There are decreases in certain places that we hope will teach us some lessons about how to decrease it more, but it is not only not decreasing, but particularly violence against women human rights defenders, activists, politicians, those who seek to bring change, is in some cases even increasing. And so I think the campaign remains relevant. We have to rethink each year, what are the ways in which we will tackle this problem globally, and at the same time, keep the local and regional initiatives at the forefront as we pursue that common goal, working across national boundaries, but rooted in our own local realities to bring an end to what is perhaps the most common phenomena in the world, a global patriarchy, which we must dismantle as a structural mandate. So yes, it continues to be relevant, and I hope we'll keep reinterpreting it every year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was really, I'm a reporter who covers gender-based violence in different parts of the world, and I came to that work about halfway into your campaign about 15 years ago. And so it's really important for me to hear the background there, to think about the local manifestations, as you say, and really the local leading the way. But of course, I've seen too, you know, despite all the progress, these things continue to happen. The violence pops up in new and different ways, and making this problem visible and maintaining that level of advocacy is such a challenge. So I'm really grateful to you and to all the partners that help make that possible. Thanks for being here. Now we have Dr. Natalia Kanem, the Executive Director of Unfpa. And thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's such a busy week in New York and for your agency. I wonder if you might tell us, as the lead UN agency focusing on sexual and reproductive health, how ending gender-based violence is crucial to the success of that institutional mission.
Well, thanks so much, Gina, for being here and for your journalistic excellence in telling women and girls' stories. Your Excellency, Dr. Elizabeta Georgievska, the First Lady of North Macedonia, thank you for your leadership, Excellency. Excellencies, Dr. Usaina Alidou, Chrysanthe D'amaraj, dear Charlotte Bunch, and staff of the Center for Women's Global Leadership, distinguished panelists, colleagues, dear young activists, dear friends, greetings, everyone. Yes, for UNFPA, this is core. Allow me to quote USA First Lady Michelle Obama. Women endure entire lifetimes of these indignities in the form of catcalls, groping, assault, oppression. These things injure us. They sap our strength. That is why the 16 Days campaign matters. And that is why sexual and gender-based violence has to end. And yes, in our lifetimes. That's my message. Women can't wait another 25 years, another 100 years. Women and girls have waited long enough. UNFPA is very proud to co-convene this 30th anniversary commemoration. With the Center for Women's Global Leadership, UNFPA, and indeed all of the United Nations standing behind our Secretary General, are passionate about joint work to put a stop to sexual and gender-based violence once and for all. Now, orange has been the color of UNFPA over our 53 years of existence, and across the over 150 locations where UNFPA works, we help to orange the world. We orange the world against sexual and gender-based violence during the 16 days, and really every day, 365 days a year, standing with women and girls and everyone who is demanding an immediate end to sexual and gender-based violence in all forms, whether it's during war and conflict, and it's been disturbing to see that cropping up, whether in communities, in the home, or online. As the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, we've been helping countries to prevent and then to respond to gender-based violence. It's part of our core mandate and one of the 3 big zeros that UNFPA advocates for as part of the Sustainable Development Goals strategy, along with meeting the unmet need for contraception and zero preventable deaths during pregnancy and childbirth. So for our strategy, zero gender-based violence by the year 2030 will mean zero intimate partner violence, zero femicide, zero female genital mutilation, child marriage, harassment, exploitation, and abuse. And is this too ambitious? No, it's not. Not for the more than 735 million women and girls alive today who are victims of violence by an intimate partner or by someone else. Not for the 1 woman in 3 And that statistic still holds. Women and girls who over their lifetime are going to experience violence, which is wrong. It's part of a damaging power dynamic that's based upon patriarchy. And it's something that has to shift now. Now, a girl must grow up knowing that it is her right to walk down the street or to take public transportation free from fear. Just over the past 4 years, UNFPA has partnered to implement hundreds of GBV programs and projects, allocating well over $500 million for the prevention, protection, and care, especially psychosocial care of women and girls affected by gender-based violence. And as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, UNFPA was among the very first to sound the alarm regarding the COVID restrictions and the implications that was going to have for increased domestic violence. And sadly, indeed today, a year and a half into the pandemic, violence against women and girls has skyrocketed around the world, including femicide, the most extreme form. And this is what CWGL is highlighting this year. The deepening economic and social stress, the COVID movement restrictions, social isolation, school closures, all of these made women and girls more vulnerable. And the so-called lockdowns decreased the spread of a lethal coronavirus, while power imbalances in societies also meant that the same lockdowns created an environment for the spread of another deadly condition, namely the shadow pandemic, which is domestic violence that was there before and grew. And no space is immune, including the online platforms that have become so essential for our daily lives. So along with that sharp increase in use of information technology, we're seeing the unfortunate proliferation of new technology facilitated violence that is intended to silence and intimidate and restrict women and girls' use of the internet. It's a pernicious form of violence because it also impacts women and girls' ability to access online services, social services, employment opportunities, and their use of personal and professional internet communications. At a time during a pandemic when a lot of these services are shifting to take place mostly online. So UNFPA is working actively to protect the virtual space and make it safe. We should not allow technology to become yet another way to silence or harm women and girls. So we're calling
Thank you so much.
We're calling for immediate and sustained action to reach and support women and girls online. And just let me end quickly by saying that for the purpose of the issue of femicide, our UN Secretary General has issued his call for peace in the home. We want to bring attention to the immediacy and the urgency of the crisis. And so let me ask you to do your piece in your space to make peace and human rights a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that overview, and also some useful and practical marching orders, which I think everyone who's eager to get working on this is happy to hear. Next, we have Chrysanthe D'amaraj, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. And Chrysanthe, I wonder if you can tell us both in the big picture, what's coming next for the Global 16 Days campaign? How do you see it evolving around the challenges that we're facing today? And in particular, why did you choose femicide as the anniversary theme this year?
Thank you, Gina. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, Her Excellency, distinguished panelists. You are my friends and my warriors in this struggle, and 16 Days campaigners. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the 30th anniversary of this Global 16 Days campaign to end gender-based violence. Thank you, Dr. Kanem and UNFPA, for your extraordinary partnership. It is humbling to coordinate this longest running campaign that has metamorphosized into a movement and a community. There's much for us to celebrate, center, and catalyze. It's evident that the 16 Days campaign has a life of its own, touching the lives of about 300 million people. To be relevant to our times, we might need to shift from the focus on ending gender-based violence to securing safety and dignity, with a global target date to achieve absolute safety and security in the home, within the community, and by the state. And Natalia spoke to this drop-dead deadline, but we might need to think in terms of a generation. Just like the absence of war does not automatically bring about peace, the absence of violence does not translate into safety and security for women and girls. When I say safety, we have to recognize it includes access to abortion, education, choosing who to love, right to land, education, as well as the work that you want to do, to name a few. Achieving safety must be included in all negotiations at local, national, tribal, regional, and international levels. Feminists must negotiate all peace processes in the world. Feminists include women, transgender and non-binary persons, and men who believe in and act progressively to advance equality for women in all spheres and uphold that women's rights are human rights. Public and private places must be safe for all women and girls. Unfpa and the 16 Days campaign has a pilot project on developing safety indicators. The media, as you know, must shift the discourse on how gender-based violence is reported. Again, the Center for Women's Global Leadership's Journalism Initiative is working with UNFPA's Syria Hub to make this happen. Charlotte spoke to this. The current patriarchal and colonial governance structure must transition to a matriarchal indigenous governance model that centers community and caring and people and the planet. The 6 communities currently that are safe for women and men, 5 of them are indigenous and all 6 have a matriarchal governance structure. COVID pandemic, crisis in Afghanistan, and the rapid climate change have provided much evidence that nothing is permanent nor sustainable in the existing system of decision-making. All this is very difficult, but not impossible. To achieve safety, we must first address the most extreme form of gender-based violence, femicide. That is our theme. Femicide is a lethal act on a continuum of gender-based discrimination, exclusion, abuse, harassment, violence, and torture. You know, in 2018, the UN Drug and Crime on Homicide reported that 87,000 women are intentionally killed, you know, and that was the number in 2017. And remember that this is only the reported killing. More than half of them, 58%, were killed by intimate partners or family members, meaning that 137 women across the world are killed by a member of their own family every single day. This makes home the most dangerous place for women and girls, making them vulnerable in every place they inhabit on a daily basis. Femicide is both public and private act that is directly influenced by structural discrimination that occupy macro-level economic, social, and political spheres. Femicide, as we already heard, transcends borders, all types of borders. Regardless of the obligation under international law and political commitments and heavy advocacy by activists, governments have yet to prioritize the accountability for femicide and its prevention. Women who occupy margins of society due to their multiple and intersecting identities, such as Indigenous and Aboriginal women, ethnic and racial minorities, transgender, disabled, and migrants, and women in certain occupations, such as sex workers, women human rights defenders, women journalists, and women politicians are at a higher target for femicide. To recognize this inextricable link between violence in the home and in the world of work, the campaign will continue its actions on ILO C-190 Convention on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. The world of work includes public transportation. You will now hear the story of Adriana. The video, please.
Dawn, is this the video you'd like me to play?
Yes, please. Thank you.
We're not hearing the audio, Peter.
There is no audio yet. It's very sketchy, to say the least. It's coming down very slowly. Give me 1 second, please.
In the interim, Chrysanthe, is it possible for you to speak to the video until we have the audio going?
Sure. So you will hear from Ernestina Enrique, Adriana's mother. Adriana was killed due to femicide, that we are being killed because we are women. 2019 marked the 30th anniversary of the Montreal massacre. At that same year, UNFPA family lost one of its members to femicide. That year, at ICPD 25 in Nairobi, the Global 16 Days campaign team declared that December 6th as Femicide Remembrance Day to honor those we have lost to femicide. So I hope you will join us in demanding accountability and end to femicide to make the world safer for all women and girls. We believe that a world without violence is possible. Thank you.
María Rosa, tirada en una fosa. El desierto se rehusó a tragarse su rocío. María Rosa, tirada en una fosa. El desierto se rehusó a tragarse su rocío.
Gina, if we can move on to the next item on the agenda, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I've shared the link with the video and the journalism project that it's based on in the chat. so that folks can find it. And hopefully when it's playing directly from the internet to your computer, you have an easier time than when we try to use the Zoom intermediary there. But thank you so much, Chrysanthe, for that look at both where we've been and where we're going, as well as the importance of femicide and the focus this year. Next, we're going to hear from Dubravka Simonovic, who is the former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And we're also about halfway through our program. So this is when my job gets tougher, because every little increment of 30 or 40 seconds over compacts what comes there at the end. And I don't want to deprive any of our speakers from sharing their remarks or our audience from hearing what they have to say. So just a reminder to everyone to look for the hand, and please not to mind me when you hear my voice over talk you if necessary. So Ms. Simonovic, I was wondering if you could give us some perspective on how you think it is that governments are falling short in preventing the provision of justice in cases of femicide in particular, and if there's maybe 2 or 3 key steps you think that governments should be taking immediately to help end femicide.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this panel. And congratulations for the selection of the topic with respect to 16 days of activism related to femicides. Let me mention that when I started as a Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in 2015, on International Day on Elimination of Violence Against Women, I have called all states to establish a femicide watch or national mechanism for prevention of femicides. And now I have finished my term as a Special Rapporteur, but I have still prepared a report for October session of General Assembly that will be introduced by my successor, Special Rapporteur, on femicide and what was achieved through this Femicide Watch initiative, because it was meant as preventive initiative. And what was clear from the beginning was that states were not collecting violence against women data inclusive of femicides. Femicides data were in homicides data. So they were disconnected. And the big step was to go in direction of understanding that collection of data on gender-related killings of women or femicide should be part of violence against women data. Then I have also suggested comparative categories, how to collect such data. And in my modalities on collection of femicide data, I have suggested objective criteria that could be followed at each state. So we have this possibility to have states reporting on number of women killed by their intimate partners, in which we have collection of homicide data based on relationship between victim and the perpetrator. So this is category of intimate partner killings. And in this category, according to UNODC data and report that was mentioned as a homicide report with separate part on gender-related killings of women, in this category, more than 82% of victims are women. So this category during the COVID-19 pandemic, due to restrictive measures, was also under specific threats, because as was mentioned, home was a very dangerous place during COVID-19 pandemic restrictions. And we have seen increase of violence against women, increase of calls to helplines, but also increase of femicides in those countries that have collected such data. Second category is data on femicides based on relationship between victim and the perpetrator that is showing family relationship, not intimate partner, but other type of family relationship. And in this category, we are seeing that women are around 64% of all victims, but there are differences in different parts of the world. And then there is third category with specific gender related motives of such killings, in which we do not have this connection between perpetrator and the victim, but still we do have specific cases of femicide that could be tracked down. What I have suggested was that each such case should be analyzed by national expert group. It could be NGO, established group of experts, it could be ombudspersons, established femicide watch, it could be interdisciplinary body, and to analysis of such cases, because we are not speaking only about numbers. Numbers are important and they should be published, and we in a long run should have possibility to compare states according to femicide rates in these categories. But in the long run, each case should be looked as a specific case in which we can see systemic problems, gaps with respect to implementation of international human rights law and different protective measures. So many cases that I have seen in different parts of the world are similar cases connected with inefficient protection orders, connected with lack of shelters, connected with lack of risk assessment that was not properly done by police officers because they were not sufficiently trained. And based on such analysis of cases, such femicide watches or national bodies should recommend measures related to changes of the law or changes of the practice or whatever is needed in order to prevent such cases in the future. So what I have seen from countries that I have visited, and I have recommended establishment of such watch, I have seen establishment of femicide watches in a number of countries, in Argentina, in Georgia, in Canada, and Israel, out of countries that I have visited, but around 30 or more countries with respect to countries to which I have recommended such mechanism. And now, as a special rapporteur, we are calling on International Day on Elimination of Violence Against Women. And also in the period during 16 days of activism, states to report to the mandate if they have established such preventive mechanisms, to send data and to send specific recommendations related to prevention of such femicides in the future. And we are seeing that this is mechanism that is giving results, because it is increasing focus, giving them tools, is giving them a model how it should be done, and how in the long run we could compare which laws and which policies and which methods are working and are giving results. So I hope that this will continue, and I hope that in the future this model will be adopted by all states, and that we will have at the UN level femicide rate, or rate that will really objectively project situation in different parts of the world. Because today we are having reports from UNODC on homicides with specific sub-report on gender-related killings of women, but we do not have administrative reports for all states in this area of intentional killings that are falling under categories of femicides. I hope that in the future we will.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. D'amaraj, for that really thorough and really helpful look at where in particular we can be pushing for more information and for more action. Now we pass the floor to Brandy Morin, who is a Cree Iroquois French award-winning journalist. Thanks so much for being with us this morning. And I'd love if you might speak a little bit to why you feel that the campaign's focus on femicide this year is important, and in particular, the context of accountability for missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Is there accountability? Is that improving? What's the view that you see there? Thanks.
Tanse, thank you to the Center for Women's Global Leadership for inviting me to speak on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So there are thousands of Indigenous women and girls across the Americas that are not safe. Being Indigenous makes them a target for violence that receives little retribution, violence so rampant that our women and girls are being taken at alarming rates. In Canada, Indigenous women and girls make up just 4% of the population, yet we account for 24% of female homicide victims. Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than any other women in Canada, and 16 times more likely than Caucasian women. You see, it all comes down to racism. So who is accountable? Racism, this systemic evil that navigates our governments, laws, and much of society. It started with the violence of colonialism that sought to conquer Indigenous nations for absorption into a patriarchal way of life. Indigenous peoples were not even seen as human beings here in Canada within the last century, and our women were for the taking. The tools of colonialism include control and oppression, which is still operating via the Indian Act, inequality, enforced poverty, and the breaking of sovereign treaties Canada signed with the First Nations when this country was formed. Canada has freeloaded off the resources of these territories, such as gold, oil, gas, timber, water, land, and profited while the First Peoples are left with crumbs. With the fallout of the atrocities of the residential school systems is intergenerational trauma. Children were ripped from their families to be educated in the white system, abused, neglected, and some even killed. Our people are only one generation removed from that era. We are still grappling with the effects. Many are broken and still working to pick up the pieces of their shattered identities. Although many are healing, we are in danger. Our basic human rights are being violated. We are living through what has been declared a genocide, and powers that be don't protect Indigenous women. Predators seek out Indigenous women because they understand that we are vulnerable due to the historic and continual tyranny against our lives. And when we go missing or turn up dead, the police are known to not investigate, or our justice systems don't prosecute or convict perpetrators. The mainstream media hardly covers us in the news either. Our women are seen as just another dead Indian, sometimes thought of as just a runaway or out on a drunk. We are seen as having no value. I have value. I was missing at age 12. I ran away from a group home after growing up in and out of the foster care system and was held against my will. I was raped by older men for days. I survived. All the ones that didn't make it out alive, they could have been me. I could have been them. Who would they have become? Canada funded a national inquiry into this crisis. Then in 2019, the inquiry released its report and 231 calls to justice. It called upon all governments to ensure that equitable access to basic rights such as employment, housing, education, safety, and healthcare is recognized as a fundamental means of protecting Indigenous and human rights, resourced and supported as rights-based programs focused on substantive equality. And they also called upon all governments to immediately take all necessary measures to prevent, investigate, punish, and compensate for violence against Indigenous women and girls. Canada delayed releasing an action plan for over a year. It's now slowly being rolled out, but we have a long way to go. Our women are still dying. I've covered countless stories of mothers, daughters, sisters, friends who have been lost to this epidemic. I've stood at the places where their bodies were dumped. I've held their loved ones as they mourned. I've felt the pain of their injustice. In a country like Canada or the US, which are admired around the world as places that uphold human rights, I often wonder how they've been able to get away with this for so long. Well, time is up. It's time to hunt down and stop this violence, the political, economic, institutional, and societal racism, so our life givers can live and thrive. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is femicide. I'm grateful to the Global 16 Days to End Gender-Based Violence campaign, and I'm grateful that they're focusing on addressing femicide because for too long the world has not taken seriously the well-being of women. Indigenous women and girls need to be included in this fight for justice because we are intrinsic to the health and future of society and the lands of Mother Earth, which sustains human life, the lands of our ancestors and generations to come. I stand behind the work of Global 16 Days to End Violence. Hi, hi.
Thank you so much, Brandy. so valuable for us to have your perspective, and thank you for sharing courageously from your story and your activism on behalf of so many people. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Aldiana Cicic, who's the chief of the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And I wonder if you might share with us how the Trust Fund itself has prioritized ending femicide, and looking ahead, where do you see opportunities for greatest impact?
Thank you so much, Gina. Let me first start by thanking Brandy for sharing her experience and her life story with us, and really appreciating everything that she said, and hoping that we can do even more to support her and all the others who went through similar experiences. Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, and everyone listening to us today, it is a great honor to be here and to be part of this significant moment in the work on ending violence against women and girls that means so much for the past, current, and future generations. I want to thank Center for Women Global Leadership for invitation, and convey the big congratulations from UN Women and from the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women on your significant anniversary. And I want to give a special shout out to Charlotte and those 25 visionary women's rights activists on whose shoulders we all stand today. Other speakers have so eloquently highlighted all the issues around the femicide, the lethal public and private act, as Chrysanthe said it earlier, which I think is a really very short but very powerful description of femicide, all the challenges and needs for accountability. So I'm going to go straight into the work of the Trust Fund and what we try to do to support the global efforts, and to highlight, would like to highlight one key opportunity that we from the Trust Fund see that perhaps we want to collectively focus on. So based on demand driven by local context, the Trust Fund has been funding work on femicide for a very long time. But the current portfolio supports about 11 projects around the world in a value of about $8 million. And these are implemented by our amazing grantees in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Argentina, South Africa, Eswatini, and Democratic Republic of Congo. As you will note from what previous panelists were talking about, all of our projects actually coincide with the countries with statistically the highest level of femicide. Notably Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras in Latin America. The majority of these projects are actually implemented in the framework in the current framework of the UN Trust Fund's partnership with the EU and UN Spotlight Initiative in Latin America and Africa, and whereby we directly support civil society-led projects which address legislative and policy gaps and strengthen institutions, promote gender equitable attitudes, provide quality services for survivors and reparations for victims of violence and their families. But one of the strongest components of these projects is their focus on strengthening and building women's movements in the countries of project implementation, as well as across both of these regions. In the past year, we have been supporting these projects also with some additional resources for women and girls impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the context of this pandemic, these grantees, as well as other grantees within our portfolio, reported an increase in femicide rates. Grantees from Honduras, Argentina, and Colombia in particular recorded an increase in femicides quite early in the pandemic, alongside the militarization of a daily life meant to enforce the lockdown. In Colombia, for example, our grantees reported the cases logged as emergencies increased by as high as 553%. These country-specific reports that we receive from our grantees align with a number of others reports by human rights organizations, media, about the rise of femicide and other forms of violence against women across Latin America. With the injection of additional resources last year due to COVID crisis, specifically into the core funding of the women's rights organizations, and our grantees resiliently adapted their programming and strengthened their organizational capability to tackle this crisis. They very quickly and very, really with a superior work, adapted both prevention and services, often stepping in to complement services provided by governments. They provided economic support, especially for the most marginalized women and girls at risk, And they rigorously documented and collected data to advocate for more progressive response to COVID-19 at the national level. For instance, just a few examples, because I'm aware of the time, the Centro de Derechos de Mujeres is a woman-led organization in Honduras implementing projects to prevent all forms of violence against women, including domestic, sexual, psychological violence, and femicide, through legal aid, legal education, advocacy, and community organizing. It has contributed to the creation and strengthening of dozens of collectives and networks of women against gender-based violence, strengthened the leadership of hundreds of women's rights defenders and activists, and promoted the formulation of laws, such as the law against domestic violence. During 2020, the project reached an estimated 1 million people through the radio programming, focusing on prevention of violence. Or Argentina, the Fundación Andes, a woman-led non-governmental organization in partnership with Kanem, that needs no description, but women's organizations network. They implemented a project to address violence against cisgender, transgender, and lesbian women, focusing in particular on violence in public spaces, including sexual violence by non-partners and femicide. So just a few examples, and I do want to jump straight into the opportunity that we see from the UN Trust Fund. And I have this highlighted here in front of me. Strengthening women's movements who are at the forefront of public advocacy to end violence against women and girls, including femicide. That is our key opportunity and key way forward. Strengthening capacity for women's movements in the grassroots civil societies that drive them forward also means creating the space for this organization to affect and create positive change, particularly for youth and for women facing intersecting forms of discrimination. I don't need to mention example of Ni Una Menos, a prominent social movement in Latin America, and all the work, what did they do? My conclusion here, my final message to all of us is properly resourcing women's movements and women's rights organizations, not only financially, but also institutionally, will allow them to advance the global efforts to end violence against women and girls, and ensure that voices of wide range of women and girls, including the most marginalized, are heard. Thank you again for inviting me. It is a great honor to be part of this discussion today and sit with you on this panel. Thank you. Back to you, Gina.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that perspective. It's so inspiring and satisfying to hear so much focus on the call for examination of and value of and contribution to local women's movements around the world, and really letting local contexts lead here. So thank you very much for that. Next, we hear from Nala Valji, who's the gender advisor in the United Nations Executive Office of the Secretary General. Hard to imagine anyone having a busier week than you. So thank you, Nala, for being here with us. I wonder if you might share with us what you see as the political commitment at the highest level in the UN to see that femicide is eliminated, and how from that view, campaigns like the Global 16 Days campaign that are led by civil society really make a difference.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina, and thank you to the Center for the invitation to be here today, and to Charlotte and the colleagues at the Center for 30 years of activism, advocacy, commitment, and partnership on the 16-day campaign, really on the front lines of ensuring that this issue is at the forefront of all of our consciousness. And I really hope that we are not having this conversation 30 years from now, and that we do drive to zero in the coming years, ending violence against women and girls. Let me also just say, as a fellow Canadian, Brandy, it is an absolute privilege and honor to be on this panel with you, and thank you for your courage and in sharing your story with us today. Gina, to the question of how is femicide and violence against women a priority at the highest levels, and I want to just begin by saying that we've really seen this as a core priority for the Secretary General in the past 5 years. Gender equality is one of his 3 core priorities, alongside climate change and the full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And within gender equality, specifically a drill down on the issues of ending violence against women and girls. At the beginning of 2020, the SG gave a policy speech on gender equality, and in that, he spoke to the issues that Charlotte spoke to earlier today, making the linkages between personal violence and international peace and security. He noted that we spend billions, if not trillions, on protecting our borders with the military, and yet half the population within those borders do not experience peace and security. And what does that mean for how we're defining peace and security? In the executive committee last year, which is a weekly meeting of the Secretary General with his senior leadership, essentially a cabinet meeting every week, there was a specific discussion on the issue of femicide and what the system-wide response on this is, and how it is that we can drive the attention and the leadership at the country level. So really from the highest levels at the country level, at headquarters in every entity, this has been a core priority. And we see this reflected at the beginning of this year, the Secretary General in his speech to the CSW, in laying out his vision for his second term, the next 5 years, spoke about the need for every country to have an emergency response plan to end violence against women and girls that is backed by policy, financing, and laws that is needed to finally drive us to zero and to where we need to be. This is also reflected in the Common Agenda report, which some of you may be aware of. This was just launched last week to member states. This is the Secretary General's vision. It was requested by the member states for the future of the UN, the future of multilateralism. And he's really placed women and girls at the center of this. And this report was the outcome of broad consultation with young people, civil society, partners across the globe. And again, that call for an end to violence against women, national emergency plans in every country around the world, because there is not a single country that is not grappling with the issues of gender-based violence. And so a real call for all of us to mobilize around this issue, and also supplemented by a broader perspective on ending violence, eradicating and reducing violence writ large. And again, making that connection that we cannot silo forms of violence. We heard today about keeping the Montreal massacre on the forefront of our consciousness. That was fundamentally domestic terrorism. We're seeing the linkages between violent misogyny and violent extremism, between domestic violence and international peace and security. So really a holistic perspective of the need to reduce and eradicate violence across the board. And then, of course, as COVID-19 was spreading in the early months of last year, as Dr. Kanem reminded us, the Secretary General, one of the first issues that he raised was the early warning that we were seeing of the increase in violence against women and girls. And in the first weeks of the pandemic, the Secretary General called for a ceasefire of violence across the board in all conflict zones, and followed that up a week later by saying we need an end to all forms of violence, from war zones to people's homes, and called for peace in the home as it's being termed going forward. So really, we have the political will at the highest levels. I want to just bring that together, however, with an initiative, and Aldiana mentioned the Spotlight Initiative, our 500 million euro partnership with the European Union. This is the largest single investment that we've had at any one time. It is a comprehensive response, bringing the UN system together around ending violence against women and girls, with civil society at the center of our response. And we know that a strong women's movement, civil society at the center, is the transformative, sustainable change that we need in this area. And so for Spotlight Initiative, half of our funds have been programmed through women's organizations, the majority of whom are national women's rights, women-led civil society organizations. Civil society is
so sorry. I'm going to have to stop you there and say thank you so much we asked you to do a lot in a very short period of time. So thank you for encapsulating as much as you could in that short window. But we're coming to the end here, and we're going to, in this last section of our time together, we're going to hear from the investigative journalist Diana Washington Valdez, who's the author of the definitive book on femicides in Juarez, The book is called The Killing Fields, Harvest of Women. And she's also featured in a new podcast, really worth a listen, really important. The podcast is called Forgotten. So Diana, thank you so much for being with us today. We're gonna have a short back and forth, you and I, around about 3 questions. And I think it would be great if we might start just with a very, very simple descriptive question of why it is you chose to document these murders in Juarez.
It became very apparent to me early on that these crimes were going to be swept under the rug, that the victims would be forgotten, and that would be the end of it. And so it became my task mainly then to document the crimes as a form of not allowing the memory of these victims to be erased, and my own way of not allowing impunity to govern the outcome of these murders. And that is the real reason why, I did it. It was obvious to me that the authorities did not have the will to prosecute the crimes, to imprison the perpetrators, and that the crimes would continue. And that was the sad part.
Have you seen that change in terms of the will to hold folks accountable? Maybe you can tell us a bit about the successes and the failures of the international legal response, of the human rights response, of the local authorities' response to the femicides in Juarez.
I would like to mention that the scrutiny from UN groups and special rapporteurs were key to bringing extra pressure on the Mexican authorities to act. And I remember the late Asma Jahangir, a special rapporteur of the UN, was the first to bring a global scrutiny to the border community and to these femicides. And then later on, it was a group of top-notch criminal investigators from the UN that went to the border community to review the case files of the crimes up to then. And they were the first to detect and to confirm that there was indeed corruption, deep-seated corruption, organized crime involved in the hand of that contributed to the impunity of these crimes. And so that was an important milestone in this whole saga of the femicides of Juarez.
Thank you so much for that. And lastly, I wonder if you could give us some perspective on what you think campaigners themselves can do to ensure the prevention of femicide on the one hand, or to really push meaningfully for accountability on the other.
Yes, I think first of all, we must all acknowledge that all the victims of femicide and all of us who are still alive today have the right to life. We have the right to live, and that right was being violated time and time again. When I heard someone mention ceasefire, is exactly what we need globally. We need an end to this violence, this systematic, unpunished violence here and throughout the world. I think that this whole project for me exposed that there were roots behind the continuation of the violence. There were cultural roots, institutionalized, and then permeating the society. And so those need to be addressed, and they need to be done in partnership with the people who are leading the way. We need to engage the politicians. We need to engage the companies here in Juarez, Mexico. We have Fortune 500 companies that employ thousands of women of the kind that became the victims, young women, locals, natives, who are always the same victim. As one of my colleagues once pointed out, the victim is always the same, a disposable woman from a poor community that no one will miss, no one will pay attention to, except that people, for example, in NGOs, the media start to highlight. That's very important. But I think fundamental for me is the right to live. All these women have the right to live. And that's why I'm in this fight, and that's why everyone should be in this fight. I think that there are technological tools available today that were not present years ago that can help with prevention efforts, and the focus must be on prevention. We can't do a lot about the victims that are deceased, but we can help try to find the missing women and try to prevent more femicides from occurring. It is important here in this community to engage, for example, these big companies that hire the women. They must be held accountable, they must be pressured, and they themselves could provide an important leverage on the local authorities. Right now, it's been, I know from the recent drug cartel wars we had in this community several years ago, that there were a lot of crimes that occurred and that are impugned. But the assembly plants, the maquiladoras, were untouched by that violence. It was almost like a silent code that was there. They are sacred, they are not to be touched. So these companies have an important power in themselves, and they need to engage with the local authorities to put an end to this systematic violence, because everyone has a right to a safe community. If you're going to invest in a community, you're going to move your resources there, you have a responsibility to say, I'll come in there to hire people, but they have to be safe. They need to be traveling back and forth safely. They need to be able to live in a community safely and not take this ostrich approach to, well, whatever happens outside the plant is not our affair. Laws, there were some important changes that have taken place in some states in Mexico, for example, as a result of the focus on the femicide. One of them is very important. Homicides should not come under a statute of limitations. There should never be a statute of limitations for homicides. Some of them will be cold cases and eventually could be solved, but they should not be swept away by a law that says, oh, it's too late, it's old case, forget it. And those are some of the comments I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I wonder, we're running ever so slightly ahead, and I wonder if I might take the prerogative as one journalist to another to pose one more question to you. Your description of what one of the factors that makes the women in Juarez vulnerable as being seen as being disposable women from a poor community whom no one will miss really echoes what Brandy Morin was saying to us about the view on Indigenous women in Canada. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the power you see on the one hand and maybe the challenges on the other for the media to be able to play a part in changing that narrative and changing that view as a form of helping bolster accountability.
Yes, getting the word out was very important to me as a journalist to bring attention to these crimes. And as a result of that kind of publicity that went around the world, then we had international organizations that got involved, Amnesty International, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, and others. And all of those served to verify that there was indeed a problem taking place here, which the authorities had always denied. There's no big deal, somebody got killed, okay. And also to start looking and examining the laws that existed that were detrimental to women. For example, classifying the murders of women as not as a homicide, but as a general crime, whereas the murders of men were classified as homicides in the reporting of the authorities. Things like that began to change little by little. Getting the word out is so important, and you have to understand that every time there's a new generation that comes on board, we can't take it for granted that they knew about all of this. And for their own safety, they need to be informed, and they need to come on board with what can we do to protect the women today, the young women that are arising. And I see another important change is that the women today, the young women, are fighting back. They're not rolling over and playing dead. Their activism is much stronger than it was in the past. They have more confidence, they have more tools, they have more awareness, they have more information than in the past.
Terrific. Thank you so very much for being here with us and for sharing that perspective of your just really incredible and needed work there in Juarez. It's nice to be with you.
My pleasure.
That largely wraps us up here this morning for hearing from our panelists, but we do have a few words from Melissa Upraiti of the CWGL, our co-convener, who will wrap us up and lead us out. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Gina. On behalf of the Center for Women's Global Leadership, I'd really like to thank the panelists and moderator, you, of today's event, for your participation and commitment to ending gender-based violence. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us and really express deep gratitude for colleagues at UNFPA and the Center for pulling this event together. I'd like to thank the many partners and allies with whom we have worked to end gender-based violence in the world of work under the current multi-year theme, and also to prepare for this year's anniversary theme, Femicide, for their deep engagement and support. Clearly, speaking truth to power is not easy, and challenging structural violence and patriarchal norms is even harder. As noted by Charlotte earlier, women human rights defenders have either lost their lives or been subjected to violence and intimidation as they seek to do so. We have been joined by some survivors today. As noted by Aldiana, we stand on the shoulders of many who have come before us. This commemorative event is a tribute to them too. If there's one thing that we've learned in the past 30 years, it's that while women in every part of the world live under the threat of violence, they are blessed with courage, ingenuity, and resilience. This is reflected each year when we carry out the annual campaign to demand a safe and more just world for women and their loved ones. It's also reflected in the activism carried out by many of you 365 days a year. Today's commemorative event marks the beginning of a series of events that will continue through March 2022. This year's annual campaign will be special as we continue to fight to end gender-based violence in the world of work. December 6th will be marked by a global call to action to end femicide. Everything you do this year will have added value in light of the new challenges that we face and recent regressions. Do sign up for our newsletter and check out our website, 16dayscampaign.org, for updates. Follow Global 16 Days Campaign on Twitter and Facebook, and reach out to us directly if you like. We hope you will join us again for future events, guided by the belief that a world without violence is possible, and because even one violent death of a woman is one too many. To quote Diana, we need a ceasefire to this systemic violence. We have the right to live. We must not let these cases be swept away. Let's get the word out. Let's fight alongside the women who are fighting back. Thank you.